Okay. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope to use our hour together to give you a kind of whirlwind tour of some of the recent research our gut health group has been doing, mostly in the diarrheal disease space. And I will largely kind of highlight recently concluded studies and some upcoming studies, and hopefully convince you all of the continued critical importance of diarrheal disease and enteric infection research as a priority in addressing child health and child survival. So I'll start with this is a hypothetical case, but based on evidence and research that our group and other groups have been doing, is unfortunately an all too common tragic kind of trajectory of some children. So this is a 13-month-old female presenting to Kisii Hospital in Western Kenya with diarrhea, watery diarrhea, dehydration, fever, moderate acute wasting or moderate acute malnutrition, and has full immunizations that are up to date, including rotavirus vaccine. This child was admitted to the inpatient ward for IV rehydration. This IV rehydration was followed by oral rehydration, and there was no indication for an antibiotic according to WHO guidelines. Was discharged a day later, and as per WHO guidelines, encouraged to continue feeding and discharged with a 14-day course of therapeutic zinc. And tragically, this child died 7 days later. So, with that case in mind, I want to discuss multiple missed opportunities for intervention and try to, highlight some of the areas that our group and other groups are researching to hopefully identify interventions that will prevent this trajectory happening in the future. So I will try to break up the presentation in 3 buckets. One focusing on the clinical management, specifically syndromic management, meaning the absence of full diagnostic workups for what's going on with the child. Then I'll talk a little bit about etiology of the underlying diarrhea and why and how that could really be helpful for clinical management, and then wrap up with some important areas for research in infection prevention and disease prevention. So starting with management. So we have recently concluded and are currently enrolling in some randomized controlled trials that are aiming to address this trajectory. The first is the Totobora trial, which I've presented in this group previously. This was a trial of azithromycin to prevent post-discharge morbidity and mortality. The second is another azithromycin trial called the ABCD study. That was, again, azithromycin for children with severe diarrhea. And then a study that we've recently launched earlier this year that is addressing or testing 2 nutritional milk-derived supplements for the promotion of nutritional and enteric recovery in children with diarrhea and wasting, Patricia Pavlinac. So let me start with a reminder of the Totobora trial. So the premise of this trial was that in that trajectory I just described, there's an opportunity at the point of hospital discharge, and rather a missed opportunity where interventions could be delivered that could improve the child's likelihood of a successful recovery upon returning home. This discharge period is a period known to be and documented to be at high risk, children to be at high risk for morbidity and mortality, and mechanisms of that vulnerability are really kind of unknown, but there's a lot of leading hypotheses related to untreated or inadequately treated infections, new infections during a period of perhaps immune compromise related to the acute illness that led to the admission, nosocomial infections, And then perhaps host response to infections, acute inflammatory processes or chronic inflammatory processes related to repair. So in Kenya specifically, this post-discharge period, this period following hospitalization, is characterized by about a 3% risk of death in the subsequent months. So 3 per 100 child years incidence rate of or mortality rate in that subsequent year. So to address this, we looked at azithromycin, Z-Pak as it's known here in the US. This is a broad spectrum antibiotic, has a long half-life. In Kenya, it's rarely used as first-line therapy, which was important in thinking about potential introduction of antibiotic resistance. And there was recent evidence of a mortality benefit of azithromycin in high mortality settings in sub-Saharan Africa. This intervention was also, particularly appealing because it has both antibacterial properties that have been documented in the literature related to the antibacterial properties. It's been a successful prophylaxis in some settings, preventing bacterial infections. And then it also has these immune modulatory characteristics that, again, going back to those underlying mechanisms that I showed you, could be important for addressing post-discharge mortality. So like I had mentioned, there were several trials in sub-Saharan Africa testing azithromycin mass drug administration, meaning giving azithromycin to the entire community, that had shown a mortality benefit. And so that was kind of further rationale why we were interested in azithromycin for this population. We also posed that if azithromycin was going to be considered in high mortality settings as an intervention for mortality reduction in children, that reducing the number needed to treat to eliminate one child death would be a number that we would want to lower so that less children are exposed to an antibiotic. And we all know of the growing global crisis about antibiotic resistance. So our hypothesis was that if we can target this intervention to a population known to be at really high risk of mortality, such as children recently hospitalized and subsequently discharged, we could reduce the number needed to treat to avert one child death from 526 to 263, simply by testing it in a population with twice the mortality rate. We also were interested in this because of this population at discharge not only had a high risk of death, but there's, a large number of children. It's easily identifiable, so hypothetically easily scalable as an intervention strategy, leverages existing health systems and programs, and is kind of a missed timeline in WHO guidelines. So we did this trial between 2016 and 2019, enrolling 1,400 children who were enrolled for all possible reasons or hospitalized for all possible reasons. We ended up randomizing 1,400 children. Only 2 did not end up making it in the modified intention to treat analysis. And this is just showing population characteristics of children in the trial. Importantly, there was good balance between the two randomized populations, and a relatively high prevalence of malnutrition, as we would expect in a hospitalized population in this setting. About half of the children were under 2, and we had a relatively low HIV prevalence in this population. As I mentioned, we had enrolled children with all diagnoses, so this was not a diarrhea specific trial. And importantly, about 90% of children enrolled in the trial had received an antibiotic. So again, I've shown this before, so this won't be news to you, but as a kind of important context for subsequent slides I'll show, we found no benefit in terms of our primary outcome of rehospitalization or death between the randomization arms. We also looked at antibiotic resistance because if there was a benefit to azithromycin, an important policy question would be, what are what are the costs of such an intervention. And so wanted to look at azithromycin resistance in E. coli and strep pneumo. This is the E. coli data. And we see, surprisingly, that children are being discharged with almost 40% of their E. coli isolates having azithromycin resistance, and this goes down over time, probably as exposure to antibiotics goes down. There was only like a modest difference between the randomization arms at the month 3 visit that was no longer statistically significant at the month 6 visit. So our conclusion here is that 5-day course of azithromycin did not induce a lot of resistance, but most surprisingly was the amount of resistance children were discharged with and how that steeply declined upon returning to communities. So next, I'll talk about a very similar trial, the ABCD trial, but this trial was focused on children with diarrhea. And instead of focusing on the discharge time point, was focused at the presentation time point, but again, trying to address these kind of longer term sequelae of acute illnesses like diarrhea. So the premise of this was that empiric azithromycin treatment of children with watery diarrhea, so meaning they really have no other indication for an antibiotic for their diarrhea, who are at high risk of diarrhea-associated mortality, which we defined as having diarrhea and either dehydration, stunting, or wasting. So we hypothesized that azithromycin could have benefit in this population over the subsequent 3 months. Another part of the rationale for this trial was in the diarrhea literature, it's been increasingly shown that the important pathogens causing diarrhea are, after rotavirus, are largely bacteria and Cryptosporidium, which is a protozoa. Many of these are obviously amenable to an antibiotic. So this trial is really challenging kind of the thinking that all diarrhea should not be treated with an antibiotic. So this trial was conducted in 7 countries. Our team, led by Benson Singa in Kenya, led the Kenya site of ABCD. And our primary outcome was mortality and length for age Z-score, an indicator of growth faltering, and which is a precursor to stunting. So this is the primary results of this trial. There was no statistically significant evidence of a mortality benefit. But the trial was stopped early because the mortality rate was much below the sample size calculations. And if there's time at the end, we can kind of talk about why we think that happened. There was a statistically significant benefit in terms of length for age Z-score, but as you can see by the magnitude of effect, it was a very modest improvement in LAZ, or rather like a less loss of LAZ in the azithromycin group. But this was a huge trial, over 8,000 children, so it's not surprising that we were in a way overpowered for that primary outcome. Secondary outcomes included hospitalization and death. There was a statistically significant benefit of azithromycin seen in the group randomized to azithromycin for the outcome of hospitalization or death. That was a little bit surprising, has not been kind of overly publicized because it was a secondary aim, not pre-specified in the design of the trial, but is provocative. And I will return to Totobora and ABCD in a moment when I start to bring in kind of the enteric infection piece. So, but last in this syndromic management space is a trial called Beresha Afya. And let me kind of share with you the rationale behind this trial. So this trial is like Totobora, really starting at the point of discharge, but is not limited to children who were hospitalized, is rather starting at the point of children leaving a health facility, either from an outpatient or inpatient visit, and then addressing the recovery, the diarrhea recovery period. So this trial is conducted among children with diarrhea and wasting. This is a really important secondary analysis that Kirk Tickell published that showed that the majority of diarrhea deaths are among children with moderate or severe wasting. And so this is a really important target population for children with diarrhea if the goal is reducing diarrhea-associated mortality. Of course, this is in the setting of rehydration. So we chose these interventions, lactoferrin and lysozyme, based on data that's been shown, and I'm talking about the next slide. This slide is just showing us, again, what I've hopefully already convinced you, that ABCD and Todobora both kind of were disappointing in that, azithromycin is not going to be the magic bullet that we perhaps thought it was going to be. And so this really motivated us to continue to look for interventions that address this long-term recovery period following diarrheal disease. The two interventions we chose, lactoferrin and lysozyme, are, as I had mentioned earlier, milk-derived supplements. They're contained in some infant formulas. There's been evidence of benefit both in terms of diarrhea outcomes, like duration of diarrhea, and also in terms of biomarkers of enteric dysfunction. Specifically, some of you may know Indy Trihan led a trial in Malawi that tested these products in children at high risk of enteric dysfunction and found a modest benefit, but important benefit with these interventions. So the aim of this trial is to determine, is a factorial, four-arm factorial trial, to see if there's benefit in terms of recovery from wasting and recurring diarrheal episodes. As part of this trial, we have nested mechanistic aims to try to understand if there is a benefit, how that benefit is working, and then importantly to also evaluate acceptability, adherence, and cost effectiveness. Ariana Rubin-Means and her team is, really being thoughtful about thinking about if this trial does show benefit, having data that will equip decision makers to, want to kind of pursue it if it's deemed that this could be a viable intervention for kids with diarrhea. So this trial is taking place also in Western Kenya, and as I had mentioned, is among children leaving the facility, health facility, with who were seen for diarrhea, but who also had wasting. And as I mentioned, we just started and results are expected for 2025. We're really, hopeful that we will see some benefit, particularly following a couple of trials that were really disappointing. But, I think it's been a humbling experience, lessons learned. I think doing trials, you have to be prepared for this result. And more often than not, it's the result that we most expect, having kind of no benefit. So we're just really eager to see what we're going to find, and also happy that we have included a lot of mechanistic aims. So kind of concluding that suite of studies around kind of syndromic management, as I had mentioned, we didn't observe significant benefit of azithromycin and Todobora or ABCD. However, both trials, especially Todobora, really highlighted that this period of post-discharge is really high risk. So 5 deaths per 100 child years. That is way over targets where we want to be with child survival. So that's an obvious opportunity for interventions. Those interventions may not be biomedical, they may be social, but there's just a lot to be done in that area. Something in terms of that I'll talk about in the next set of slides is we're still interested in whether there's a subset of children who may have benefited from azithromycin that's kind of hidden or obscured when we aren't taking underlying etiology into account. And then, of course, the rationale for the last trial I shared is that, alternative interventions to antibiotics need to be explored. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about etiology. So hypertension hypothetically, had we had the ability to do molecular diagnostics of the stool sample from this child, we would have known that this child was had been infected with Shigella flexneri 2A. This is the most common Shigella subserotype that we see in Kenya, and is very common and plays a large role in watery diarrhea, and that's kind of new. It's a gram-negative bacteria with incidence rates as high as 43 cases of Shigella diarrhea per 100 child years in low and middle income countries. We all know Shigella is a leading cause of dysentery, but what's been increasingly shown with the increased use of molecular diagnostics is that Shigella is also a really important and leading cause of watery diarrhea and even dehydration. The highest incidence is among toddlers, although the peak incidence rates really do vary by setting. Shigella is estimated to cause about 60,000 deaths in children per year, and is importantly highly associated with linear growth faltering, again, a precursor to stunting, which we know has long-term implications to childhood development. So in both the Totobora trial and the ABCD trial, we were interested in understanding whether enteric infections were an important stratifying factor in looking at azithromycin effects. So the rationale for kind of this suite of sub-studies is both studies saw no or modest benefit of azithromycin. We know that enteric bacteria, Shigella specifically, but others as well, and antibiotic resistance in gut bacteria may modify azithromycin's effect. It could be that azithromycin is only beneficial in a subset of children with bacterial pathogens like Shigella. If we were to see that, if we were to find that, that would have implications for the potential rationale for a point of care diagnostic. If the benefit of azithromycin, for example, in that ABCD trial is limited to those children, then there would be rationale to really maximize benefit while minimizing antibiotic resistance if the subset of children who benefit from an antibiotic could really be targeted by, understanding etiology. So the ASEAN enteric study is, again, the sub-study of the Totobora trial. The first aim is to look at enteric pathogens at the point of hospital discharge and link those with clinical and anthropometric outcomes, and then to see if azithromycin, if these pathogens modify azithromycin's effect. Our second aim is to do a similar analysis, but looking at antibiotic resistance in the gut microbiome. Again, with the rationale that carriage of macrolide resistance in the gut microbiome may really have an impact on how azithromycin works or doesn't work. And then the third aim is to determine whether azithromycin has an impact 3 months later on enteric pathogens and antibiotic resistance markers in the gut and try to estimate any mediation effects. So this was a study that was able to leverage samples and data from the Totobora trial. We're doing quantitative PCR on all stool samples from the enrollment and month 3 visits of that trial, looking at various pathogens and antibiotic resistance genes. This is just really early data from the discharge time point. We see, probably unsurprisingly, children are being discharged with evidence of bacteria, parasites, and viruses in their gut. The clinical relevance of this, hopefully we can unpack a little bit by tying to the outcomes, the clinical outcomes in the trial. EAEC is an enteric bacteria that is well known to be kind of asymptomatically carried. So I'm not surprised that it's here in such high prevalence, but it's really unknown, and Totobora offers us this unique opportunity to really probe what the consequences of that carriage in this population might be. And this is just kind of combining that pathogen data together to show that about 40% of children are discharged with a bacteria, about 15% with an enteric virus, and about 15% with a parasite. And as I mentioned, we'll be linking that with various outcomes, including linear growth. This is also a snapshot of the antibiotic resistance data that we're collecting from the quantitative PCR. We've tested for multiple macrolide resistance conferring genes and beta-lactam conferring genes. As you can see, this data is complex. It's going to be I think important for us to rationalize how we're going to interpret this data, linking it with the azithromycin randomization and outcomes. But probably not surprising, we see evidence of a lot of genetic markers of resistance at the point of hospital discharge. Depending on what cutoff you use in terms of calling a gene present, we could see up to 100% of children having a macrolide resistance conferring gene. Okay, and then so next we're doing we did a similar sub-study in the ABCD trial. I'll call this ABCD enterics. Here we first wanted to look at the underlying etiology of diarrhea among children in the ABCD trial, and to address this question of effect modification, whether there's a subset of children who have a bacterial etiology who benefit from azithromycin. We recently had this manuscript accepted in JID. It's been a long time coming, so I'm happy to share that data today. So this is a snapshot of the pathogens that were causing diarrhea among children enrolled in ABCD. Again, ABCD enrolled children across 7 countries, all with diarrhea. All children were under 2. And this is watery diarrhea. So we see kind of a pathogen distribution that we would totally expect, which is rotavirus remains a leading cause, even though many of these countries have introduced rotavirus vaccine. Shigella is, in this case, a close third. Second is enterotoxigenic E. coli with the pathotype of ST. We combined the pathogens and categorize them whether or not a child had a likely bacterial etiology versus not, to try to unpack this question of effect modification. And what I'm showing here is that subgroup analysis. So this is the outcome of diarrhea on day 3, so 3 days after enrollment in the trial. This is when this is the last day of the azithromycin. It was a 3-day course. And we see among children with enteric bacteria, a significant benefit of azithromycin in that group, that close to 12 fewer cases of day 3 diarrhea per 100 among children randomized to azithromycin versus placebo. Interestingly, we did see a statistically significant benefit of azithromycin in the children without a bacterial pathogen, but it was much more modest. When we look at the longer term outcomes at the 90-day time point, we see kind of a similar trend. So with the outcome of death alone, there does appear to be a benefit of azithromycin in the kids with a bacterial pathogen, not in those without, although it's not statistically significant. But if you look at 0.3% of kids died in the azithromycin arm compared to 0.6 in the placebo. When we have a combined outcome of death or hospitalization, again, a similar trend, a statistically significant benefit among kids with a bacterial pathogen in the associated with azithromycin. And then linear growth does not follow the trend we were expecting. We see a really similar benefit in kids with and without a bacterial pathogen, the implications of which are kind of unknown. It could be that the no bacteria group includes bacterial pathogens that are just not at the etiologic level. So there's still some benefit to treating those kind of asymptomatic bacterial pathogens. Or it could be that a benefit of azithromycin for linear growth doesn't have to do with its antibacterial properties, but maybe instead its anti-inflammatory properties. So, and anyways, interesting to think about that there. But what another kind of analysis that we were really interested in is we have this huge trial with pathogen data, and we really wanted to look among children with a given etiology, bacterial etiology, what was the benefit of zithromycin. This is starting with Shigella. We had over 800 children with Shigella in ABCD and saw a substantial benefit of azithromycin for the outcome of day 3 diarrhea and delta LAZ. We've reviewed the antibiotic literature for Shigella and other systematic reviews, and this ABCD data provides by far the largest randomized control trial of children with Shigella, and really, has left us with thinking that treatment of Shigella diarrhea, if Shigella can be identified at the point of care, could really have results in big improvements among children with diarrhea. When we look at another leading bacterial pathogen, STEtec, of which we had almost 900 children, we see very similar kind of trend. And then typical EPEC, which is less common, but really an important pathogen in infants. And we see a benefit for day 3 diarrhea, no statistical, significant benefit for the other outcomes, but certainly a trend that we would expect. So what we conclude from this suite of studies so far, and very, very much these are ongoing, is that children under 5 discharged from hospitals in Western Kenya likely have a high burden of AMR conferring genes in the gut bacteria. This could be modifying azithromycin. Children with diarrhea who have a bacterial cause of their diarrhea may benefit from a short course of azithromycin, and identifying children with these bacterial pathogens and or antibiotic resistance, if we find that's an important modifier at the point of care, could really be an important targeting strategy for antibiotics like azithromycin. Okay. Just pausing here. I don't see any questions yet, but I will try to leave time for some questions. Okay.
Great. Yeah, this is a lot, Patty. So
now, yeah, totally. I know.
A ton of
information.
So I'm sure there'll be a lot of good questions.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for bearing with me. It's always a challenge to know how much to present or not. So I appreciate you all sticking with me. I know it's a lot. Okay, so to conclude, I just want to share a little bit about what we're doing in the infection prevention space, or kind of early research that we're trying to do in this area, recognizing that this is such an important area that is way larger than the types of studies we're doing. But I did want to, highlight this Enterics for Global Health Shigella surveillance study, because it's an early study aiming at eventual vaccines against Shigella. The rationale behind this study is that there's kind of a renewed funding and scientific interest in Shigella, in part informed by some of this really recent rich data highlighting Shigella being such an important enteric pathogen for kids. And there are several vaccine candidates that are in the phase 1, phase 2A stage of development that will hopefully be ready for a phase 3 trial in 2025. So EFGH was conceived as a preparatory study for those eventual Shigella vaccine trials, both to generate data that could inform the design of those trials, specifically, accurate power calculations for those trials. We all have seen over and over again that improper power calculations can really make or break a trial at the end line. And also to ready potential phase 2B and phase 3 Shigella vaccine trial sites for a quick initiation of a vaccine trial. So the types of questions that still need to be answered in the Shigella vaccine space are some of these are highlighted here. So let me take a step back. I think, so based on the burden data, the current thinking is that a vaccine would be introduced around 6 or 9 months, and that would be it would be 2 or 3 doses, and that the vaccine should confer protection for at least 24 months, hopefully longer. But there are several questions that still need to be answered, like what is the right age of introduction? You don't want to go too early when the vaccine schedule is so crowded that many implementers may not be open to considering another vaccine. But also the later you introduce the vaccine, and you don't want to interfere with maternal antibodies, but the later you introduce the vaccine, you run the risk of it being harder to get into the vaccine schedule because there's less scheduled time points. And then you also don't want to miss those early Shigella infections. And as with most diseases, that first year of life infection risk and severity can be higher. There's also this question of number and the timing of doses, the optimal clinical outcome definition so that the trial kind of optimizes its both efficiency and likelihood of detecting an effect, and then determining what the ideal microbiologic conformation of Shigella would be. Traditional culture, which is the well accepted, tried and true method, but it's highly insensitive. So there's also appetite to consider qPCR, and kind of COVID really put that on the map for us of using qPCR or molecular methods for confirmatory testing in a vaccine trial. Sample size is obviously really critical, and having incidence estimates in the potential places of a clinical trial is kind of best case scenario. And so that's what EFGH is trying to do. So our goals, again, are generating data that will inform efficacy trials and readying sites for those trials, so that, again, the time between a phase 3 trial and ideally vaccine introduction can be shortened by being really thoughtful about all these decisions that go into a trial and making sure things can just move quickly when there are really good candidates. So the primary aim of EFGH is to determine the incidence of Shigella attributed medically attended diarrhea among kids 6 to 35 months. It's a really specific age range because that's really the age range that's being considered for a vaccine. Looking at the incidence by various stratifications like serotype, severity, laboratory method, age, and season. Looking at antibiotic resistance in Shigella, we have read in the literature Shigella antibiotic resistance is important, and not only in low-income countries, but also here in Seattle, there are outbreaks of multi-drug resistant Shigella. So this is very much on everybody's mind. We also want to document consequences of Shigella diarrhea. This is important for policymakers to emphasize the importance of a potential vaccine. And then look at various severity definitions, cost, and laboratory methods to try to, again, optimize that eventual trial. This study is being conducted in 7 countries from around the world, and we are about 1 year in. I thought, of interest perhaps to this group, many of whom are epidemiologists, we spent a lot of time planning in this trial how to design this, it's not a trial, study, how to design this study to estimate incidence rates. And of course, when estimating incidence rates, kind of the method we usually think about is a traditional cohort study where you follow people over time, follow children over time as they develop Shigella diarrhea. Instead, we were worried that would be too costly and too time consuming. So we instead landed on an alternative approach where we are recruiting cases from health facilities and then doing population enumeration to estimate the denominator, and also adjusting that proportion for healthcare seeking behavior to capture the fact that by recruiting cases only from health facilities, we are missing some children with Shigella diarrhea. And in the interest of time, I'll probably just leave it at that about the design option. So yeah, we're using a facility-based design and adjusting our incidence rates for healthcare seeking. And as highlighted in the aims, we're enrolling cases and then following them up for 3 months. So we started this study in mid 2022 and are planning to end in mid 2024, end of year 2024. And we're really hopeful that this timeline will align with vaccine candidates, and hopefully some of these sites will roll into a Shigella vaccine trial. So conclusions: Shigella is a pathogen, that I feel strongly about. The burden data suggests it's a really important pathogen, and vaccines against this pathogen, or all enteric pathogens, but specifically Shigella, holds great promise for aversion of morbidities, growth stunting, and antibiotic resistance around the world. And optimizing the design of eventual licensure Shigella trials will really hopefully shorten the time to vaccine availability and uptake among the target population of children living in low and middle income countries. So returning to our hypothetical case, I hopefully kind of convinced you that there are so many areas for intervention in the starting from prevention of infection at the point of presentation and admission, so around the healthcare visit, and then at discharge. And a multi-pronged approach seems like the only way that we as a field can really make impact. And our team is trying to, in its little ways, trying to address these areas as much as possible. I want to acknowledge just the huge team that we have around the world and the leadership around the world making these studies possible. Here are some names that are just critical to this kind of research agenda. So that is it.